Morning and good afternoon. We're on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis, 12 lines up before the end of the Amud, Bishlema Rabbi Yochanan. So just to review, we had a contradiction between two Mishnayos. The Mishnah here in Masechta Ksubis establishes that if a man has an ones relationship with any of the ladies that are listed in our Mishnah, including Achoso, his own sister, then he pays Knas. The Mishnah in Makis, on the other hand, says that Abal Achoso, etc., gets Malchus. So to reconcile that contradiction, we have a parting of ways between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says it all depends on whether there was Asra for Malchus. In our Mishnah here in Ksubis, Perikei Lunaris, there was no Asra for Malchus, therefore there's no fee of Malchus, and therefore he pays Knas. The Mishnah in Malchus is talking about a case, on the other hand, where there was a Asra for Malchus. Hence he gets Malchus, and therefore we have a principle called Eino Loka Mishalem, and he's potter from Knas. Reish Lakish disagrees, and he holds that our Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Meir, who holds Loka U'Mishalem, and therefore our Mishnah mentions that he gets Knas, he has to pay Knas. The Mishnah in Makis adds and completes the picture, and he gets Malchus. So he gets both Malchus and pays Knas. Bishlem Rabbi Yochanan Lo Omer Kireish Lakish. I understand why Rabbi Yochanan is inhibited, because the Kalmokimle Kirabanan, he would prefer interpreting our Mishnah and attributing it to the Chachamim, whereas Reish Lakish pushes us into a corner in which we have no choice but to assume that the authorship of both Mishnayos here and there is attributed to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the Das Yochid. Ela Reish Lakish, my time alo Omer Rabbi Yochanan. What bothered Reish Lakish about interpreting that our Mishnah is talking about a case where there was no Asra, whereas the Mishnah in Makis is talking about a case where there was Asra? It seems like a very smooth reconciliation. And the Gemara says, Amar Lecha, Reish Lakish would respond, Kevan de ilu asru be potur, kilo asru be nami potur. Here we have a breakthrough shita of Reish Lakish, namely that in a situation where the Avera itself is an Avera Hamachayeves Malchus, then the principle is Eino Loka Mishalem. And that would apply whether or not he will get Malchus. We don't look at the implementation of the punishment, but rather we look at the Avera per se, and we define and classify the Avera in abstract terms. Reish Lakish holds that even if he was a shogeg, but he violated the Avera, which, had he been amazing, he would be Chayav Malchus, then he's not Chayav Mama. And therefore, Reish Lakish does not have the luxury of interpreting the Mishnah here at the beginning of Elunaris in Ksubis as a situation where there was no Malchus, because there was no Asra. The absence of Asra, according to Reish Lakish, is irrelevant. We rather classify the Avera, if it's an Avera Sheish Malchus, and that would apply in a Mamzeres case, and certainly how much more so in the case of Achoso, where the possibility, in theory, would be that there would be Malchus, and there been Asra and Malchus, then there's no Tashlume Mama, because the principle of Eino Loku Mishalem, according to Reish Lakish, depends not upon whether or not we will implement the Malchus, but whether or not the Avera per se, in and of itself, would, in theory, generate Malchus. The Azdu L'Tamayu. And this Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish is consistent with the way Rav Dimi, Ki Asa, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Amar said that Chayve Misos Shogegin. So now we're going to switch our approach, our scenario to a case of chayve misos, and we're talking about someone who violated a chiyuv misa b'shogeg, which means that he was unaware of the severity of the Isur, or alternatively, he was amazed, but there was no hasra. V'chein chayve malkios shogegin, u davar acher. Davar acher means mama. So you have two scenarios. You have chayve misos shogegin. You have chayve malkios shogegin. And in both cases, simultaneous with his chiyuv misa shogeg and his chiyuv malkis shogeg, he incurred a chiyuv mamon. Rabbi Yochanan says he's a shogeg. Bezdin will not implement the punishment, neither misa nor malchus, and therefore there's nothing to knock off the chiyuv tashlumei mamon. He will pay the davar acher. Reish Lakish Amar Potur. Reish Lakish holds that since the avera that he violated was either a capital crime in theory or a chiyuv malchus in theory, that's enough to knock off the chiyuv mamon, the davar acher, and it's irrelevant whether he will get misa or malchus or he will not get misa malchus, even though he's a shogeg. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav. Rabbi Yochanan says in the case of shogeg, he's chayav to pay the davar acher. Why? The holo asrube. There was no asra. Bezdin's hands are tied. They cannot implement a corporeal punishment of either misa or malchus, and therefore Bezdin has a free hand to implement and require that he pay the mamon. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, the halach of kimlei b'derabim is a halach that addresses Bezdin, and Bezdin cannot implement a double punishment for one maisa. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, Amar Potur, Evan Dilu Asri Be Potur, Kilo Asri Be Nami Potur. Reish Lakish understands that Kimlei B'Derabineh is not addressing and limiting Bezdin, such that Bezdin cannot implement two punishments, but rather, according to Reish Lakish, the halach of Kimlei B'Derabineh is inherent in the Maisa Avera. If the Avera is so chamura Avera, that if, in theory, a hasra was given to him, he'd be chayav by the misa of malchus, that's enough to remove a chiyuv mama. Because according to Reish Lakish, the entire emphasis is on the Maisa Avera. A Maisa Avera will be analyzed based on the Chumras Havera. The Chumras Havera is an abstract categorization. It does not depend upon whether this individual, when he violated that Avera, he was culpable and punishable according to law. It's irrelevant. We're interested in one and only one thing, and that is the nature of the Avera. If the Avera per se is classified as one that generates either Misa or Malchus, then we apply the principle of Kimlei, and he doesn't pay Mammon. Now, at this point in the Gemara is going to go back to the biblical verses in the parsha of Kimlei b'Derabineh, Yason Yeh Anoshi Anesh, when the Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim that two men were in a battle. We'll call it a boxing match. And one struck out with his arm, and instead of hitting his rival, he hit a woman, a pregnant woman. And one of two things happened. Either as a result, she died, or as a result, she lost the volados. And the Torah says, Ki notzu anoshim v'nodfu isha hara v'yatzu yiladeha. So scenario number one that the Torah addresses is where she lost her babies, her yiladeha. And the Torah says, in that case, v'lo yeh ason, which means, according to Reish Lakish at least, she did not die. She survived it. Her Philodos did not survive. Is Anosh Yeonish. And Anosh Yeonish means that he will pay damages. He will compensate what's called Dmei Philodos. Esvei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. The lo son Anosh Yeonesh. If she survives, the Torah says, he is punished, and v'nosan beplilim, and he will pay a compensation for the Dmei V'lodos. And now we start Daf Lamed Hey, today's Daf. My love, ason mamish. Don't we take the Torah literally, as we usually do? And everything depends on whether or not she survives. That means, by implication, that if she dies, heaven forbid, then he has to pay Dmei V'lodos. The Torah does not qualify and say, well, he had a hasra. The murderer, in this case, had a hasra. It's implying that everything depends upon one thing and one thing only. Did she survive? Did she not survive? If she didn't survive, then there's no Anosh Yeonesh, and he doesn't pay Dmei V'lodos. And why doesn't he pay? Because she died. And if she died, he's guilty, albeit perhaps b'shogeg, if there was no asra, of murder. And murder, of course, is the most severe crime. It's an avera if we classify it as an avera chamura, and it's enough if we define the avera as an avera chamura to knock off the chiyuv mama. So the Torah says that if lo yeh ason, she survives, then he pays Dmei V'lodos. If she dies, she doesn't pay Dmei V'lodos. According to Rabbi Yochanan, that's not true. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it really depends upon whether Beis Din would put him to death, not whether she dies. The fact that she died is not in and of itself enough, according to Rabbi Yochanan, to exempt him from paying Dmei V'lodos. You'd have to add another condition, and that is that because of the Asra and the fact that he was amazing, Beis Din will put him to death. Therefore, he's potter from Dmei V'lodos. And Rabbi Yochanan defends himself by reinterpreting the pasuk ason and saying, "Lo, it doesn't mean ason that she died. It means din ason, the din of a murderer who has what's called mishpat moves. Ika diamri." We have another transmission according to which Esvei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, we switch around the tables, and it was Rabbi Yochanan who objected to Reish Lakish. The pasuk says, "V'lo yason anosh yeonesh." My love, din ason. We should interpret ason from a juridic, from a legal perspective, as referring to whether or not the makeh, that's the person who murdered this woman, in a case where she died, has a din ason, which means that he is chayav misa. If he's not chayav misa, lo yason, then anosh yonesh, and he'll pay Dmei V'lodos. If, on the other hand, she died, but she died plus, we have to add the other condition, that there's a din ason, which means that the murderer was well forewarned that he would get misa. Beis Din is now going to implement the death penalty, and he doesn't pay Dmei V'lodos. But that's because Beis Din is implementing the death penalty. And Rabbi Yochanan makes it all depend upon whether or not there was hasra in such a way that Beis Din will actually put the murderer to death. Comes along Reish Lakish, and he says, "Lo, that's not what the Torah has in mind. Ason mamish." Let's translate the word ason literally, not in a legal context, but in a physical context. And ason means that she died. And the Torah is saying if she didn't die, then he pays Dmei V'lodos, implying that if she did die, he is exempt from paying Dmei V'lodos. Whether or not we put him to death and there's a din ason or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is, as we said over and over again, the nature of the Avera. Omar Rava, Rava is now going to raise an objection to Rabbi Yochanan from a brisa that records a drasha of Tana to Bei Chizkiah. And the Gemara is assuming, and that's what puts Rava at alarm, that this drasha of the Bei Chizkiah is ironclad. It doesn't lend itself to another opinion. And this is very often true, that the Gemara quotes a brisa or a Mishnah with a stam, with a Tana without any dissenting view, and the Tana quotes a drasha, and the Gemara assumes that no one could possibly question that drasha. That's the premise here that Rava operates with. Could there be such an opinion? Namely, like Rabbi Yochanan, that we don't apply Kimle b'derab in the case of a shogeg, when he violated an avera for which, had there been a hasra, he'd be chayiv misa. But Tana de Bei Chizkiah. Now the drasha of the Bei Chizkiah, which is based on a pasuk at the end of Parshas Emor, is a very complex drasha. I always find in Daf Yomi that the most challenging parts of Daf Yomi are the drashas. And this is no exception. Because what this drasha is going to do is, it's going to create an inverse relationship. Let's see it. The Torah says, Make Adam u'Make Behema. In one breath, the Torah addresses the case of a mazik who destroys someone else's property, that's called Make Behema, and the case of a murderer called Make Adam. The point of this hekech in the drasha of Tana de Bei Chizkiah is that we don't differentiate between Mazid and Shogeg, meaning that Kavana is irrelevant. And we're going to start with Make Behema. We have a principle with regard to Nezikin that runs the following: Adam Muad Liolam, which means that a person will pay compensation for destroying someone else's property, whether or not he did so deliberately, inadvertently, without kavana, whether he did it derech yerida or derech aliyah. A person, when he's on his way up, usually is focused on climbing up. He doesn't focus so much on what goes behind him. Whereas on his way down, we expect him to be more careful. And in all cases, Adam Muad Liolam. There's a famous machlokas between Tosas and the Ramban in Masechta Bava Kama about a case of what's called Karov Lionis. But barring that case, Adam Muad Liolam, and the Torah is not going to differentiate between Mazid and Shogeg. Uma Make Behema. Now we'll understand the hekesh that's implicit in this pasuk according to Tana Bei Ochi Lakabo, Bein Shogeg, Bein Mazid, Bein Miskaven, L'she Eino Miskaven, Bein Derech Yerida, Bein Derech Aliyah. And we don't make a distinction, Lefotro Mimama. We logically and intuitively would have said, well, maybe he should only be chayav if he was Miskaven, if he was Mazid, if he was Derech Yerida, but not Derech Aliyah, etc., etc. No. The Torah says El Chayva Mama, and the Gemara Bava Kama is going to derive that this chiyuv of Make Behema applies in all cases, namely because of the principle of Adam Muad Liolam. Now we get to the hekech. The pasuk starts with Make Adam. We're talking about a murderer now. Af Make Adam lo techalik, but we're not going to make that distinction. But here it's going to be the exact opposite. We're not going to make that distinction. And he's always going to be potter from mama. Whether or not he's a mazid, whether or not he's a shogeg, he's a miskaven, he's an eino miskaven, b'derech yerida, b'derech aliyah, l'chayv v'mena l'foto mama. And this is clear-cut proof for Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan, that in all cases of chayve misos, he's potter from Tashluma. In the case of Makeh Behema, of a Mazik Moment Shel Chavero, he's always going to be Chayav. And that's the expression, Adam Muad Liolam. But once we have Makeh Behema, without any distinction between Mazin and Shogeg, we will likewise, with regard to the Chiyuv Mammon, apply the principle in Makeh Adam that he's always going to be parted from Mammon. Whether or not his murder was punishable by law in the courts, namely Mazin, or he was exonerated because there was no Hasra, because he was a Shogeg. In all cases, he's parted from Mammon. And that would give us the Shita of Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara is so convinced by this proof that it backtracks. And what we know is that Rabbi Yochanan was in Eretz Yisrael, and there in the Holy Land he had two main Talmidim, Rav Dimi and Ravin. I wonder how often in Shas, today we have computers, so you don't have to be the Vilna Gaon to figure this out. How often in Shas we have Rav Ravin and Rav Dimi arguing with two different traditions about Rabbi Yochanan and what he said in Eretz Yisrael. So when they came to the center of Torah learning at that time in Bavel, they each brought their own tradition. The Gemara has now completely destroyed and undermined the tradition of Rav Dimi, and now we have to supplant it and replace it with the tradition of Ravin. Amar, what did Ravin tell us? Not the way Rav Dimi had it. Even Rabbi Yochanan accepts the basic principle of Chumras Havera. Don't look at the Gavra. Don't look at whether or not Bezdin is going to implement Misa. Look at the Avera itself. If the Avera would, under certain conditions, namely if there was Asra, would generate a Chi of Misa, then there's no moment. Even Rabbi Yochanan accepts the fundamental breakthrough of Reish Lakish based on this drasha of Makeh Adam, Makeh Behema of Tanit Bechizkiah. And therefore, in Chayve Misos, Ritzicha is just one example, there are many, he would not pay Mammon even according to Rabbi Yochanan, and even if he was a Shogeg, and there was no Hasra, and Bezdin only has to implement one punishment, namely Mammon, he's off the hook. So then, what is the machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? Ki pligi bechayve malkios shogigin the davrach is mom. And here we have Rabbi Yochanan's shita chayav, and Rabbi Yochanan makes a very simple, straightforward calculation. He says the following: Chayve misas iskish. Chayve malkius lo iskish. We can't go beyond the hekesh. The hekesh between Makeh Adam and Makeh Behema is clearly in the case of murder, and that's Chayve misas. But we have no reason to assume and undermine our intuitive, logical understanding of Kimlei B'Derabinei in other cases other than Misa. And therefore, in other cases, for example, Malchus and Mammon, we're going to apply our intuitive understanding. Namely, it all depends upon whether Bezdin is implementing Malchus. In the case of Shogeg, therefore he will pay Mammon. Everybody knows it's Beferish. I don't know. Do you know? So the Gemara says, Heichan Ribsa Torah. Where did Reish Lakish see that the Torah equated Chayve Malkios with Chayve Misos? We had a whole sugi, if you remember, Hananya, Mishal, and Azariah. What would you prefer if you had a choice? Malchus or Misa? And the Gemara says, depends on Yesh Lakitzvah, Yesh Lakitzvah. But right now, the Gemara wants to know, where's the equation between Chayve Misos and Chayve Malkios? Omar Abaye Asya Rasha. We have the famous, world famous Kseret Shava. It's so famous that we all know about it, right? Actually, Rava didn't know about it, but Abai knew about it. And in two parshios, the Torah used the word Rasha. First of all, the Torah uses the word Rasha with regard to the prohibition at the end of Sefer Bamidbar of taking a kofer for the Nefesh Rotzeach. And there, the Torah calls the Nefesh Rotzeach a Rasha. Asher hu Rasha Lamus. And if we look at the end of Parshas Ki Teitze, in the Parsha of Malchios, there it says, "V'hoyim ben hakos harasha mipila shofet mikol from kidei rishaso." Again, the word Rasha. Rava says, you know what? I don't need your Gzeret Shava between Malchios and Misa. I have it in the Parsha of Malchios itself. I don't have to stretch my arm all the way out to Chiyav Misa. The Torah says, Asyav Makir Makir. There's a hekesh in the Torah between Chayve Malchios and Makir Behema. Now the Gemara goes into an entire discussion about where and which pasuk exactly has that hekesh. Amalei Rav Papa Rav Hey Maka. Where is the pasuk of Maka that I can use to set up this hekesh between Chayve Malchios and Makir Behema? If it's the pasuk that we quoted earlier from Parshas Emor. If anyone wants to open a chumash, very, very kedai to see this inside. By Yikra Perek Chaf Daled pasuk Chaf Aleph, and it says there, "Umake behemi shalmedu umake adam yumas." Very familiar pasuk. We had it just a few lines ago. So that doesn't make any sense. Rava, you can't quote that pasuk as a basis for a hekesh between Chayve Malchios and Chayve Makir Behema Mazik, because the Torah is not talking there about Chayve Malchios. If it says Maka Adam, he's Chayv Misa. Ela Hai Maka. It must be a different Maka in an earlier pasuk in the same perek Chav Daled in Vayikra, but this time pasuk Yud Ches, and there it says Umake Nefesh Behemi Shalmena Nefesh Achas Nefesh. Now, what's exactly going on in this pasuk? And we really don't know what's going on in this pasuk unless we read the very next pasuk, which is pasuk Yud Tes, and there it says Ish the Ish ki itein mumba miso kasher osa ken yasalo. So mumba miso means that he hit a person, HIT, gave him a smack, and Kenye Asalo, we're going to do to him what he did to his victim, and we're going to be Mechayev him Malchus. So in this pasuk, we're talking about Chayve Malchus. Now the only problem is that it doesn't really say Makeh Makeh the way Rava had it. So that's the Gemara's objection. V'hai lav Makahi. The pasuk doesn't use the word Makeh. It says Ki yitein mum be'amiso. So the Gemara answers to defend Rava. What did he mean by Makeh Makeh? Don't take me literally, says Rava, but anan hakah hakah kavrina. I'm talking about hakah. And Ki yitein mum be'amiso is referring to hakah. So it's not what you call Gzeres Shav. It's more of a hekesh. But in any event, the hekesh is between Makeh Behema, because it says Makeh Behema, and in the next pasuk, Yitein mum be'amiso, and that's called Hakah Hakah in the final version of the Gemara's understanding of Rava. And that hekesh tells me, as we said before, that just like in Makeh Behema lo chilaktabo bein mezid l'shogeg lefotro el lechayvo, so too in the case of Hakah bi'adam, and now we're talking about Makeh Adam, not in the sense that he killed a person, but rather he hit a person and he violated the law of Ben Yosef. In such a case, he's Chayav Malchus, and we're going to say that he's got the same status as Makeh Behema, but just in the reverse. and lo chilaktavo ben mezid l'shogeg lefocho moment el lechayvo moment. So the Gemara raises the following objection for Ki Ksiv b'chovel b'chaver hu ksiv. Hey, wait a minute. This parsha of Ki'itein Mumba Miso could hardly be a source from which you're going to derive the conclusion that he's potter from Malkut, from Mammon, because we're talking about Chovel b'Chavero. The Torah says explicitly with regard to Chovel b'Chavero, the Ish Ki'itein Mumba Miso. And then it says at the end of the pasuk, it says, Shever tachas shever. Actually, it's the next pasuk, pasuk Chav. Shever tachas shever, ein tachas ein, shein tachas shein, kasher yitein mum ba'adam. And here we emphasize the last three words in the pasuk. Kain yinosein lo. Kain yinosein lo means davar nitan miyad liyad, and we talk about mama. How so? Now we're saying lo chilaktavo lefotro lechayvo el lefotro. So what are you telling me? That he's potter from mammon? What do you mean he's potter from mammon? The Torah says that a chovel b'chaver is chayiv mammon, and the answer is that it depends on what kind of chavola in monetary terms he did. Chovel b'chaver bar tashlumanis, where it says in eno inyan lakoshi yesh bar shava pruta, the Torah says explicitly edi nosein bo, that he has to pay up for a chavola that's worth at least a minimum of a pruta. Pruta is a shear of mammon, minimum shear of kol tarkula. Now, in a hakosh ein b'shava pruta, he's chayiv malchus, right? There are tzvei dinim. It's a brisket tzvei dinim. If a person hits his friend, that's the shalom, then there are two dinim. One din is a punishment for the crime and the violation of the law, and another din is paying damages, but there's a basic nafkamina between the two. You only pay damages in a hakosh ein b'shava pruta, unless the shava pruta doesn't incur a chi of damages. Masha ein kain. In the case of punishing him for violating the law, it's irrelevant whether it was hakosh yesh b'shava pruta or ain't b'shava pruta. And now we're saying
which law are you over? Which law are you over?
Pen Yosef, which addresses, of course, the shliach bezdin. He's not allowed to give a 40th lash, but from that the Gemara derives in two places, in Masechta Sanhedrin and Masechta Makis, that law applies to you and I as well, not only to the shliach bezdin. Anyone who does hakah is going to be in violation of the law of Pen Yosef, and he gets malchus for that. And it doesn't matter whether he incurred a financial loss that's payable, that's suable in a court of law, even if it's ein bo shava pruta, he will get malchus. And now the Torah is telling me that we have a hekesh between Makkah behema and the case of Achiv Malchus for Makkah Adam, telling me that we don't make a distinction between Shogeg and Mezid. And now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha here on